Hello, welcome to Vibration Cinema, the alter destiny of film. We are recording in the woods, so there might be crickets and birds and shit like that. But today, we are celebrating our 10th episode by supposing a new historization of cinema, which also doubles as our second channel series, Les Histoires du Cinéma. I presented part of this video during my Film Futura lecture, which, by the way, was an incredible experience and an honor to partake in. Shouts out to the Film Futura 2021 cohort and the No Evil Eye team for having me. I can't wait to see in like 5 years how much Film Futura has shifted our approaches to cinema and redefined our common sense notions of filmmaking. When I say common sense film history, I'm speaking of a particular history that the industry cobbled together that serves as a kind of tautological justification for industry practices. At least here in America, if you're educated in film, and I don't mean just in film school, if you're self-educated by reading books on filmmaking, if you were interning on sets, if you're learning from YouTube and forums, you're inundated with the basic premises that work in favor of the industry. Continuity editing, tried and true lighting ratios, narrative beats on certain pages, etc. The role of common sense film history is to make the industry's niche way of doing things as naturally inevitable, no possibility for other methodologies. Around the release of Birth of a Nation, the industry coalesced on prestige cinema, movies with stories based on literature, theater, and the Bible, done in the style that ultimately led the foundation of common sense notions of narrative filmmaking. But if you look before 1915, you see a wide array of different methodologies and intentions of cinema. Many of these early languages of cinema were cannibalized by the burgeoning industry. So a chase film, like How a French Nobleman Got a Wife through the New York Herald personal columns, which stands on its own novel spectacle, transforms into a spectacle element of narrative cinema, like when Gus chases little sister in Birth of a Nation. If you look at our online and digital platforms like Vine, TikTok, and YouTube, you see a resurgence of pure enjoyment of these novel spectacles. Part of the culturally imperialistic MO of the industry is to destroy the traditions of cinema that it doesn't absorb. But it isn't totalitarian. Alternatives exist at the edge of the industry and persist, sometimes in secret. If we can navigate these murky waters of marginal, underground, and independent cinema, can we trace a history of cinema from Méliès to Vine? That's the question that this episode poses. First, I want to start with the horse in motion, often considered the first mechanically produced moving image. And its historical significance is mostly relegated to that. But what I find interesting is the story behind it. Leland Stanford, then governor of California and founder of Stanford University, commissioned Edward Muybridge to photograph different stages of a horse galloping and a bet with his friends that at one point, mid-gallop, all the horse's hooves leave the ground. So what we have here at the birth of cinema are two sciences and two games: zoology and kinesiology, and gambling and horse racing. Primitive cinema, as it's called, is positioned as the clunky experiments that ultimately led to the narrative cinema we know today. But what's often overlooked by this history is that science and sports have always been and continue to be central pillars of the cinematic practice. For sports, we see the beginning of cinema, the spectacle of physical fitness in the strongman films, which later get eroticized by beefcake in the 1950s and 60s, and then become part of gymfluencer culture today. And to this day, we still continue to watch great moments of athletic feats, including gymnastics, ice skating, basketball, tennis, etc., with the Olympics and, ESPN and all that. And sports have developed their own aesthetic with particular angles, rhythms, chirons, etc. It's also interesting to see, in the instance of swim photography, how in the 1930s, Jean Vigo's impulse to track Jean Terry by panning is maintained today, but with much more sophisticated technology like dollies, zoom lenses, fly cams, etc. And as we saw in custom couture cinema, Coppola uses sports switcher technology and applied it to his concept of live cinema. Dance sits at the intersection of sports and art. And of course, dance and athletics are cultures of movement, so again, we're talking about what I like to call kinesthetics, how cinema interacts with, celebrates, distorts, and toys with motion. As with much of early cinema, there is a colonial history here with regard to race. A particular lineage that I want to acknowledge here is the colonial documentation of non-white dance practices that persists even in our modern film practices, like with movies such as Paris is Burning, in which the white slumber Jenny Livingston documents ball culture. But with video and digital camcorders, icon Jack Mizrachi and others forged the cinematography of Vogue, a particular and common way to photograph themselves. Notice how stationary the camera is, how the zooms are only used to fit a little bit more or less information, the relationship between the spectator, the camera, and the performer. All of this is lost when the photography is in the hands of big conglomerate shows like Warner Media's Legendary. Not only is the cinematography and editing completely different, but as Simone Tichy notes about the end of the episode battles.
So when you're battling, this is what I found weird on the show, that we had to stay on one side, the other person had to stay on the other side. Battling is very like, boop, 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 boop.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
like, and you couldn't really like move to the other side because they had this whole COVID thing. I'm like, bitch, we're on the same stage, bitch. If this COVID, yeah, so it was like, I felt like that took away from the aspect of really actual ballroom battling. So to me, it just felt like I was voguing up there by my damn self.
So as ball culture goes mainstream, elements of performance and kinesthetic that they created are erased, even as legends as Jack and Naomi are involved in the show at high levels. But this isn't a read, because history isn't a linear process, and conversations of assimilation and negotiations are always going to persist in this industry, especially under capitalism, regardless of if we willingly participate or not. So I err on the side of creating cinemas that make sense to us in whatever capacity we can, because we can glimpse what is possible. That's a very big part of queer and Black politics and culture, imagining a better future and living in it presently. Under the tyranny of narrative cinema, athletics has become stunts and dance has become set pieces. But with GoPro and iPhones, sports and dance become simple pleasures again. In the early days of motion studies, certain athletic feats were recorded to see how the musculature stretched and compressed, and there is a continued continuity of the relationships between science, cinema, and athletics. We've already touched on race science and the colonial motion studies in other videos, so consider this my making note of that again here. Out of this complicated history, we have other legacies of science cinema that include medical imaging technology, space photography. As for space science cinema, we see with Interstellar, for example, where the scientists and the filmmakers put the mathematical equation of black hole into a digital imager, and we learned that the gravity of a black hole is so intense that it actually pulls light particles from the other side into view. Or here in Tree of Life, where macro photography of chemical reactions are used in a sequence which situates personal grief in the context of the formation of the universe.
Jack!
Someone like Jean Penlev, who made videos of hard-to-see sea creatures in the 1920s. Many deep-sea excursions inadvertently caught rare or never-before-seen sea animals, and fisherman photographer Roman Fedorstov documents his haul of weird-ass fish on Instagram. This loops back into the deep-sea documentary films of James Cameron and narrative filmmaking in his supposedly upcoming new Avatar sequel. In our conversation about science, specifically zoology, and its relationship to cinema, it would be absolutely remiss of me to not mention one of the longest and most beloved traditions of film, the cat video. The link between science and technology is inextricable, and of course cinema is a technological art, so there's always going to be a relationship between science and cinema. As technology and cameras become more sophisticated, scientists can see farther out into space or smaller microbial thingies and render them in a workable visible 3D model. This phenomenon of using the camera to see what our eye cannot see, or at the very least to see it differently, dates back to Maury Bridges' horse. But it's Dziga Vertov and the Kinox who formalized the theory of the KinoEye. Vertov was interested in using the KinoEye in some sense to defamiliarize our way of seeing. Closely tied to this is of his new way of seeing is the birth of the new society of the USSR. If we can see our world anew, we can see new futures of living. But he was also very curious and playful and would stick the camera damn near anywhere that he could. We'll get into the political aspect of this history later, but for now I want to highlight how Vertov's playful nature persists with GoPro users sticking the camera damn near anywhere they can. But also, GoPro is the standard camera for most board and biking sports. And there's a whole subsection dedicated to like animal POVs. So again, we have modern camera technology going all the way back to Maury Bridges' horse.
So that's the vibrating vocal folds, about 120 hertz.
In articles like Primitive Cinema and the Cinema of Attractions, Tom Gunning argues that early cinema was anything but unsophisticated. Early cinema often played at festivals and wharfs, fairs, etc. And like the Ferris wheel or the Snake Lady, people enjoyed the cinemagic of sight gag films, comedies, and even minstrel shows. With the advent of prestige cinema, however, the industry retained some of these cinematic attractions by folding them into narrative cinema with chase scenes, sex scenes, fight scenes, and other kind of spectacles. I would argue that, among other factors, the business acumen of who would become movie moguls didn't know how to tap into what the streets wanted. Because we see now with short skit platforms like Vine and TikTok, a lot of the principles of Cine-Magic developed by Georges Méliès persists and remain popular today. Méliès's particular form of cinematography and editing, the continuity of the frame, right, tricks us into believing that a skeleton can become a woman, a painting can become alive, a ladder can change into graffiti, is carried on with more sophisticated technology by modern creators like Zach King. In opposition to the magic and fantasy and sci-fi of Georges Méliès are the inventors of documentary, Auguste and Louis Lumière. There's an informal thread of film history that suggests reconciling fantasy of Méliès and the reality of the Lumières is one of the major contradictions spurring on cinematic development. Is film part of the positivist scientific method or merely just spectacle entertainment? It's behind André Bazin's criticism of Sergei Eisenstein. If you ask any CG artists, they have an obsession with photorealism in rendering their images. Reality provides only so much spectacle, but too much fantasy prevents the suspension of disbelief. But what if the Lumières were never realists? What happens to this contradiction that's supposedly at the heart of film's development as an art form? Daisuke Miao details how Japanese Ukiyo-e woodblock prints influenced French Impressionism, which was the prominent art movement when the Lumières are making their movies. The Lumières even commissioned Japanese filmmakers like Tanichi Shibata to make movies for them. This is a complicated history that Miao documents in his book Japonisme and the Birth of Cinema, because while there is a power imbalance here, the Japanese government and film industry created export films to entice European and American investors and tourists. Nevertheless, Japanese visual culture had a major impact on French painters and some of the most important early filmmakers. And seriously recognizing that influence forces us to reevaluate not only the origins of film, who was involved, and the significance of their early works and the lasting influence. I would like to suggest that the actuality pictures, which are cinematic documents, but which are also influenced by the Ukiyo-e prints by way of Impressionism, are the origin of vlogging, and that in the legacy of these movies lies the 60s and 70s New York independent film practitioners like Jonas Mekas and Edward Owens, who documented their families in experimental ways, and the AIDS video activists like Marlon Riggs and Greg Bordowitz, who documented their medical and political fight with AIDS through bits and sketches. And a particular form of vlogging which emerges before the YouTube algorithm consolidated around influencers is exemplified in the work of Hana Fubuki and Matthew E. Carter. We are going to return to this history between French Impressionism, Japonisme, and the Lumières in the episode on realism, which is definitely coming out at some point in the future. I want to circle back to Jean Penlève, who we mentioned in regards to zoological documentary earlier. As James Cahill notes here and in his book Zoological Surrealism, one, his name is actually Jean Penlève. I just don't speak French because it's a stupid language. But more importantly,
all students in the Sorbonne's Physique, Chimique, et Sciences Naturelles, or the physics, chemistry, and natural sciences sequence at the university were required to study comparative anatomy. And among the students who followed the same sequence of courses, and in fact had the same teachers just a few years apart, were André Breton, Louis Aragon, Jacques-André Boiffard, a classmate and close friend of Penlève's, as well as Penlève. Now, if these names ring some bells, it's because they are the founders of Parisian Surrealism. And one of the key arguments of my book, plug again, is that the French iteration of Surrealism owes important debts to the practices of seeing, dissecting, comparative thinking, and imaginative reassembly first rehearsed in the comparative anatomy laboratories of the Sorbonne. It is at the dissection table that the original exquisite corpses of Surrealism were born.
So again, we have the intricate relationships between science and mechanical image making, but also we have a history of documentary methodologies that are neither simply observational or positivistic, but are instead entrenched in art movements. One of the earliest ways that we were able to see movies is with the kinetoscope, which is a single viewer experience. Then, in the early days of projection, movies would commonly be screened in bars and speakeasies. Then, as the industry consolidated on mimicking the stage theater experience as a template, which becomes our modern film theater experience, some of the oldest film theaters, like the Wometoscope in Canada, are actually renovated vaudeville and stage theaters. I want to note that IMAX theaters were once almost exclusively housed in science museums. Again, the importance, for better or worse, of science to cinema rather than drama. But despite the advancements in projection and the supposed communal aspects of film watching per common sense film practices, one of the most popular ways to watch movies today is on a personal device like a smartphone or a laptop. Single viewer experiences like the kinetoscope, which was once considered primitive, become common modern practices. This scene from Iron-Jawed Angels is indicative of how Hollywood rewrites its own history. Why is Hilary Swank being hushed in a silent movie? What's of note here is that when cinema existed in bars and speakeasies, and even in the early days of theater, that is, importantly, before sound, many various political groups, including suffragettes, unions, and anti-lynching groups, would use movies as an excuse to gather covertly to discuss political actions. Because of the nature of sound, using movie halls as an organizationing space died out. But in radical film practices like in Third Cinema, the film is merely a detonator for political action. And with Hour of the Furnaces, Fernando Solanas and Octavio Gattino would show the parts of the film that were relevant to whatever audience was present at the time. And they would stop the movie if the audience became more interested in actually organizing and debating politics. In this alternative distribution model, again, film becomes a pretense for political organization. And in more modern examples, the Beijing Queer Film Festival, which was held in libraries and living rooms and study halls covertly, because the event was illegal up until 2006. Chinese filmmakers like Lan Yu, Scud, and Kui Zhen would make LGBT films in China and would often sneak them out of the country on floppy disks, hard drives, USBs, etc. to reach an international audience while bootlegging their own film for domestic distribution. I'm emphasizing the more political aspects of cinema here, where such gatherings were illegal and attendees would be severely punished if caught. But gay filmmakers used the porno circuit to get their stuff funded and distributed. Black filmmakers continue to use the church circuit as a means of distribution, and some modern independent filmmakers use YouTube and Vimeo, troublesome and myopic as they may be, to self-distribute. Vertov also pioneered the use of the Agit train, one of the earliest mobile cinemas complete with a car he used for editing on the go. This was instrumental in keeping remote communities informed with national development as well as general information sharing across the country, teaching rural communities about the city folk and vice versa. To this day, many countries and cities continue to use mobile cinema mainly for family entertainment, but it's still a cute idea. The idea of a nomadic cinema is a key component of the philosophy of our friends over at No Evil Eye Cinema. With everything that we've discussed in this video, there are contours and nuances that a YouTube video can't cover. I'll try to link as many further readings and further viewings as I can below, but this is more of a survey to jostle the mind. This isn't meant to be a definitive history. It's too speculative right now to be so. But I'm not wrong by any stretch of the imagination. If anything, I'm probably too conservative and linear. But what I hope is valuable here is that my sense of curiosity and skepticism inspires people to rethink and reshape history. Despite the bullshit, I love early cinema, and I found that making connections from Méliès to Vine, Vertov to GoPro, made film history relevant to my students. We tend not to think of the youth as valuable contributors to cinema, but since Vine, they've ran the comedy scene, and taking their work seriously and placing it in a historical context engages them in ways that rehashing some bullshit about Citizen Kane and 400 Blows just doesn't do. There are innumerable micro-histories to cinema as well, so we'll definitely be rewriting some history in the future. But that's it for today. You know the drill. Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Next up, we're gonna get a little bit messy with our return to Eyes and Teeth, this time covering trauma porn. Love you all madly. See you on the next one.